We invite you to stay tuned for the live broadcast of the Wednesday evening Bible study of the Mayfield Drive Baptist Church, located at 271 Mayfield Drive, Smyrna, Tennessee. We will now join the service.
We are back again. We welcome you to our Wednesday evening Bible study. We are continuing on the subject of the chief, which we are taking a look at the life of the Apostle Paul. So we welcome you this evening. We're going to look at number 24, and this is the Ephesian riot. The Ephesian riot. And our text comes from Acts chapter 19 again, and we read about 20 verses of this, 21 through 41. So after these things were ended, and I will address what things are in when we get there, Paul purposed in the Spirit, when he had passed through Macedonia and Achaia, to go to Jerusalem, saying, After I have been there, I must also see Rome. So he sent into Macedonia 2 of them that ministered unto him, Timotheus, that's Timothy, and Erastus. But he himself stayed in Asia for a season. And the same time there arose no small stir about the way. For a certain man named Demetrius, a silversmith, which made silver shrines for Diana, brought no small gain unto the craftsmen. Now he didn't do this for Diana. Diana was the goddess that he was doing, whom he called together with the workmen of like occupation, and said, Sirs, you know that by this craft we have our wealth. Moreover, you see and hear that not alone at Ephesus, but almost throughout all Asia, this Paul hath persuaded and turned away much people, saying that they be no gods, which are made with hands. So that not only this our craft is in danger to be set at naught, but also that the temple of the great goddess Diana should be despised, and her magnificence should be destroyed, whom all Asia and the world worshipeth. And when they heard these sayings, they were full of wrath, and cried out, saying, Great is Diana of the Ephesians. And the whole city was filled with confusion. And having caught Gaius and Aristarchus, men of Macedonia, Paul's companions in travel, they rushed with one accord into the theater. When Paul would have entered in unto the people, the disciples suffered him not. And certain of the chief of Asia, which were his friends, sent unto him, desiring him that he would not adventure himself into the theater. Some therefore cried one thing, some another, for the assembly was confused, and the more part knew not wherefore they were come together. And they drew Alexander out of the multitude, the Jews putting him forward. And Alexander beckoned with the hand, and he would have made his defense unto the people. But when they knew that he was a Jew, all with one voice, about the space of 2 hours, cried out, Great is Diana of the Ephesians. And when the town clerk had appeased the people, he said, Ye men of Ephesus, what man is there that knoweth not how that the city of the Ephesians is a worshiper of the great goddess Diana, and the image which fell down from Jupiter. Seeing then that these things cannot be spoken against, ye ought to be quiet, and to do nothing rashly. For ye have brought hither these men, which are neither robbers of churches, nor yet blasphemers of your goddess. Wherefore, if Demetrius and the craftsmen, which are with him, have a matter against any man, the law is open, and there are deputies. Let them implead one another. But if ye inquire anything concerning other matters, it shall be determined in a lawful assembly. For we are in danger to be called in question for this day's uproar, there being no cause whereby we may give an account of this concourse. And when he had thus spoken, he dismissed the assembly. Now, all of that was necessary for our lesson this evening. And by way of introduction, Paul was making plans to go through Macedonia and Achaia, and from there to go to Jerusalem. He also planned, after being in Jerusalem for a time, to go on to Rome. In preparation for that, he sent Timothy and Erastus to Macedonia, but he remained in Ephesus for a while longer. Did you get that? Okay. While he remained there, a major event became. I know how, excuse me, I'm going off here and I shouldn't be.
Thanks for reminding me.
And I'm not even have any idea even who that was that so rudely interrupted this year. All right. While he remained there in Ephesus, a major event began. Now let's look at the riot. Verse 23 reads, And the same time there arose no small stir about the way. The Roman theater played an important role in the riot at Ephesus against Paul and the early Christians, according to Luke's account in Acts 19.
Brother Joe.
Yes, sir.
It's interesting that when you see this, you would wonder, how could people hear him way on the top? That's an architectural, it's just how they did that, and yet they could be down at the bottom and do what they do and say what they need. Everybody heard.
Yes.
I could say this. At the Colosseum in Rome,
Yeah.
you can be down in the bottom,
Yes.
and you can hear other tourists talking on the other side.
Yes.
The sound carries very well. I mean, you can't get to the upper reaches, they only allow you at the bottom. But on the bottom, you can hear someone, 50 yards on the other side talking in a normal manner. It's very, the sound carries. You're right, it's a marvel of architecture and how
Architectural marvel.
Yes.
sound carries very well.
Yes.
Remember that there was a church in Texas when we were doing some deputation, and it wasn't a huge church, but it was in a like a semicircle. But if people were talking up front, people in the back could hear what they were saying, and vice versa.
It's like an open air amphitheater,
Yes.
and the way it's layered.
There were many theaters like this through the ancient world. But this one was believed to be the largest. it held, and let's see, you've got now let's back up here. This Roman theater, yeah, this is the one. It could hold 25,000 people. Okay? And it was believed during this riot that it was probably pretty close to being full. So I wanted to put that in there because this is the very place that this event is happening. According to Acts, the riot would have occurred at the end of the missionary visit of Paul at Ephesus, around 55 or 56. This says CE. AD is what we better know it as. How accurate is Luke's description of Ephesus at this time? Well, good question. Archaeology gives new reality to Paul's Ephesus riot. In the July-August 2016 issue of Biblical Archaeology Review, James R. Edwards, the Brunner Welch Professor Emeritus of Theology at Whitworth University, describes how archaeological evidence fills in the historical context for Luke's account of the riot at Ephesus. I'll give you a minute to get that big word written down. All right. In the Roman period, Ephesus was an important commercial center. Excavations conducted by the Austrian Archaeological Institute since 1895 have shown that the ancient city, which rivaled Antioch as the third largest city of the Roman world, boasted a harbor, various civic structures, bath complexes, a theater, and the Temple of Artemis, one of the seven wonders of the ancient world. I'll give you a minute to write that down. Temple of Artemis. Everybody up? 4 times the size of the Athenian Parthenon. The famous Temple of Artemis held 127 gleaming marble columns that stood 60 feet tall and were topped with ionic capitals. Ionic capitals. It was the Temple of Artemis, the silversmith Demetrius argued in Acts 19, that was being threatened by the Way, the early Christian movement, and Paul's missionary effort. Now, this Temple of Artemis is the same Temple of Diana. Okay, Artemis was just another name for Diana.
It would look like something like in Nashville.
No. That was the Parthenon, which was in Athens.
Okay.
That's a copy of the Parthenon in Athens.
Okay.
The Greek and Roman architecture wouldn't have been the same.
Right. This, to my knowledge, there is no comparison.
Okay.
And this Temple of Diana or Artemis was about 4 times the temple that you find, the Parthenon in Athens. So it was a totally different thing. All right, in saying that, quote, gods made with hands are not gods, Acts 19:27, Demetrius alleged Paul was harming the silversmith industry that made little shrines used as dedicatory offerings to Artemis, tarnishing the reputation of the Artemis cult at Ephesus. However, a 16-line Greek inscription discovered during excavation showed that a century after the mission of Paul at Ephesus, or in the late 2nd or early 3rd century, the silversmith trade and the cult of Artemis were still thriving. How about that? Now, this was the so-called beautiful Artemis statue. It was one of the 4 statues of Artemis excavated at Ephesus in 1956.
Must have been their idea of modern art.
You're right. Measuring 5.7 feet tall, the statue dates to the Hadrianic early Antony periods, 117 to 150 CE or AD. On either side of Artemis are female deer, and the zodiac signs appear on her upper chest. Rows of oval pendants, possibly representing bull scrota, hang from her chest. She also, if I am remembering correctly, she was also the goddess of fertility. All right, these attributes, according to Biblical Archaeology Review, author James R. Edwards, may represent, quote, Artemis's ultimate trophies in taming and subjugating the quintessential symbols of virility, unquote. According to the silversmith Demetrius in Acts 19, the mission of Paul at Ephesus threatened the reputation of Artemis's cult. How about that?
Perhaps because they knew that it was not real gods they were making, and Paul was going to.
Never.
That looks better than what was in this picture.
Yeah, it's insecurity.
Can't figure out who would come up with that.
Good question.
There had to be one person had to come up with that, idea, and then they just took off on it.
And then it spread.
Yeah.
Well, no doubt, this was a very valuable, financially speaking, statue. And there's no doubt that what Demetrius and his cohorts were making made them wealthy.
Oh, yes.
They would probably, people would come to worship that, he would have these little things he made, making some big.
And if I've read this correctly and understand it correctly, they needed one of these things that they made in order to make an offering to her.
Oh, there you go. It's all about the money.
It is? Say more about that in a little bit. When the anger that Demetrius incited reached a fever pitch, the rioters were said to have rushed into the city's theater, dragging Paul's travel companions, Gaius and Aristarchus. It's a mouthful. excavations have uncovered the theater, which is set into a steep hillside at Ephesus. That's the reason that acoustically it's like it is. You've got the solid stone going up a hillside, and everything is solid. Okay? Just like in our auditorium, my voice bounces off the walls.
But I bet that the wind comes in behind the speaker and pushes the sound up as well.
That could very well be. A wind could have it doesn't tell us in which direction that it's faced or anything, but that could be a benefiting thing as well. If you will remember, at the feeding of, I think, the first feeding of the 3,000 on the Sea of Galilee, Jesus was standing on the seashore, remember? But that particular area went up, raised up into a hillside. And so with Jesus standing there at the water's edge of the Sea of Galilee, his voice would be projected up and everyone will be able to hear him without any problems. We would probably need amplification, but Jesus didn't. All right, massive in scale. The semicircular Roman theater held 25,000 seats and was one of the largest in the ancient world. If you're not familiar with the Biblical Archaeology Review, it's a magazine that's put out by the Biblical Archaeology Society, I think it is.
I got it years ago.
Yeah, I did too, but I don't now. I guess they still send out magazines, but you can get everything online. Now, we must not make a mistake in thinking that this riot was a standalone event. You know what I mean when I say standalone, don't you? That there was no outside influences causing it to happen. That's not the way it was. It was not a standalone event.
Like the riots today.
Sorry?
Just like the riots today in all the states, they're not a standalone event.
That's true. They are not standalone events. It followed fast on the heels of the uproar of the demon-possessed man, the expensive bonfire of books, and the salvation of many as a result. Remember last week, we looked at the fact of, the sons of Shiva. Well, they tried to cast out the demons out of this one fellow and got a massive whipping for their efforts. And you remember, God got the glory because many believed because of it, because of this incident. And then secondly, all of these that were dabbling in the occult, or maybe more than just dabbling, they may have been fully involved in the occult. They brought their writings, their, we would say, printed materials, and they had a big bonfire. And we looked at the cost of that in modern day finance, and we saw that it was astronomical. All right? And then we have this. Now, that way that Demetrius said refers to the efforts of Paul and his companions and the result of the work of the Holy Spirit. It wasn't just a small happening of people being saved and added to the church in Ephesus. The church at Ephesus probably became quite large numerically. And then, sad to say, we get down to Revelation and we find an entirely different church in Ephesus.
Lost their first love.
Yes. But it was referred to, the whole thing, people being saved and added to the church, and the walk and the efforts and the evangelism and the mentoring, I guess you would say, discipling that went on. It was all lumped into this phrase, the way. When you see that term, it amounts to, it's taken in all of the work that Paul and all of them were doing. I would suppose that the old adage of money talks would certainly apply in this situation. Demetrius and his fellow craftsmen were seeing a substantial loss of income because of the results of the gospel. And of course, this did not sit well with them, since they had become quite wealthy through their efforts in working with the silver idols of Diana. Yes, ma'am.
Question for you. Now, when these guys went and did all this, couldn't that be comparable to what they used to do a lot, the preaching on the street corners, and still in some places they do preach on the street corners, but a lot of people used to go to different houses and have Bible studies and talking to people, and people would bring them, people would be saved. You know, early in the U.S. history. I guess that's just not something they do anymore, or not very much anymore, do they?
Going from house to house.
No, wasn't going from house to house, but they would go to, they would have people's houses that would be, invite them to come and say,
Yes.
people would come and talk with them. And
Yes. Well, what I was going to lump that into going house to house is almost a thing of the past in our day and culture. Say again?
No, that's not what we're talking about. Going to house to preach.
I was thinking probably because it's been tainted by Jehovah's Witnesses.
No. And then, to give you an illustration of how bad it is in the U.S. now and England, there was a lady. England has, let me preface this by saying, England has a law, and the United States has a similar one, that you cannot do certain things in front of an abortion center. Mm-hmm. And you can only get so close. This lady, about a month, maybe 2 months ago, stood across the street on a public sidewalk in front of one of these abortion clinics and just stood there. Didn't say a word, didn't move toward the clinic, but bowed her head and prayed silently. She was arrested. When they went to court, it was thrown out. But now this week, she went back, same place, did the same thing, and she was arrested again. They said, because you be praying in your head for something against that abortion clinic. It's fact. We'll see what her second trial comes up as. You cannot, and I use her as an example. What she never said a word.
Where was this?
In England.
England? Right.
They have similar laws that we have here in the U.S. concerning those things. So, if it happens there, it's bound to happen here, sooner or later.
Brother Joe, and then
Yes, sir.
on the other side, every effort is being done to eliminate scriptural New Testament churches. Now,
Yes.
I'm not talking about corrupt Christianity. I'm talking about eliminating scriptural New Testament churches. Just because we're hearing this thing going on with the Jesus Revolution, that's pulling more people away from the scriptural New Testament church.
That's right.
That's what's happening. And what's interesting, you have to be careful when secular society begins to put applause on quote-unquote Christianity, because it's not Christianity at all.
The Christian.
Society is applauding it.
Yes.
That's a good reason to
Step away.
Look at it exactly the same
take a
way.
closer look.
Exactly.
The chilling thing about that is that the whole concept of Christianity is going to be focused around that.
Exactly.
And those who are not like that, namely us, are going to be radicals.
Yes.
Okay? All right. When they saw that Paul and his team had been successful in preaching the gospel in Asia to the point that the silversmiths were convinced that a continuation of the way would take over the lives of all people and take away their livelihood. But as we noted earlier, clear up into the almost 200s, the silversmiths were still making a good living. They were also convinced that the temple of the goddess Diana would be neglected and the magnificence of the edifice would be destroyed. They were certain that all Asia and the world worshiped the goddess Diana.
And that world is the known world.
That was the known world. We know that actually the known world of that was only a fraction of the entire world. There was already several Chinese dynasties that had gone on. There were dynasties in India and so many different places around the world, including in the Americas. So there was a lot of world left that wasn't like the Asians. All those that were listening to Demetrius began to chant loudly, "Great is Diana of the Ephesians." And because of the uproar that Demetrius and his fellow craftsmen and the entire city was in total confusion.
They were trying to drown out what Paul was saying.
Well, Paul didn't get in there.
No, but they were trying to drown out
Whatever truth was to be said, they didn't want it said. They wanted only their version of events to be known. Sound familiar today?
Was that week?
In this confusion, the mob seized Gaius and Aristarchus, men of Macedonia, who were part of Paul's entourage, and with one mind rushed into the great theater. Remember, I said that it had 25,000 seats. Paul started to go into the theater, but he was restrained by the disciples. Then certain of the chief of Asia, which were his friends, unquote, also sent word to him that he should not enter the theater because it would put his life in danger, as well as the disciples. Now, these, in other reading that I've done on these certain of the chief of Asia, which were his friends, these were rulers and politicians and people who were in power. Paul had made some mighty powerful friends by the means of the gospel. Just as a side note, like Brother Bernie's footnote, a side note here, I seriously doubt that we have but just a small sampling of the people who came to know Jesus Christ.
Yeah.
Because after Paul and his entourage were moved on, there was a church there that was still going and doing. Okay? And who knows who they reached? Verse 32 reads, "Some therefore cried one thing and some another, for the assembly was confused. And the more part knew not wherefore they were come together." Talk about confusion. This one party said one thing, this over here said another, and the biggest majority of them didn't know why they were in there to begin with. They just went along with the crowd.
A lot like our riots right now.
Yes, sir. Some were saying one thing, the others yet another, to the point that very few knew the real reason they were even there. Most riots in America are started by agitation.
Yep.
Certain peoples hired to stir up a crowd until they become a mob
Frenzy.
in frenzy.
Mentality, there is no reason.
That's correct. The Jews put forward a man by the name of Alexander to speak to the mob. Why was he put forth? To make a defense is unknown. He was not of Paul's company. One writer that I read after put forth this thought, that he maybe was trying to keep the Jews in good favor because they knew that Paul and some of his entourage were Jews as well. But that's strictly speculation. When it became known that he was a Jew, whatever he would have said was drowned out by the voices of the people in the theater. "Great is Diana of the Ephesians." And this went on by a space of 2 hours. Can you imagine? 2 hours, people shouting at the top of their lungs, "Great is Diana of the Ephesians, great is Diana of the Ephesians." That would get pretty old to me. 2 hours worth without cessation. Woo. The town clerk was able to get the attention of the crowd. He began to praise the goddess and to appease the mob. He stated that the things concerning the goddess was well known and could not be overthrown. I mean, he really built it up. So, he says, why is this ruckus being carried on? You know all of this can't take place. You know that the temple can't be you know. So he says.
He literally took their argument away from them.
He did. Yes, he did. He took the argument away from them. It is necessary for them to be quiet. He stated that the men, the disciples who were apprehended by the mob, were neither robbers of temples nor were they blaspheming the goddess. He further states that if Demetrius and his fellow craftsmen had a charge, it must be brought to the deputies for investigation. He continued to state that if there were any other matters, it should be determined in a lawful assembly. And he basically said, this ain't no lawful assembly. Let's consider the use of the word assembly for a minute.
That's Brother Bernie's word.
Yeah,
Assembly.
one of my words. Get her done.
The Greek word for it is ekklesia.
That's Brother Bert's word.
That's my word.
Most of the time in the New Testament, it is used to describe a local church.
And you notice how in the KJV, it's used incorrectly here. It says church.
Yes.
And it's not. It has nothing to do with the church.
What has happened is that the King James translators, instead of translating like they did so many words, instead of translating this Greek word, ekklesia, correctly and say an assembly, they said church. Well, no wonder there's so much confusion about it, church. Jamie?
There's a good reason for that.
Yes, there is. Tell us.
The good reason that they did that, I say good reason facetiously. The good reason is that they were trying to do away with the Congregational Bible and the Assembly Bible that were already out prior to the King James Version being the translation for the King James Version to be completed. There were already two English Bibles in existence in England at that time,
Yes.
but were not approved for the Church of England. And correctly translated those words. That's why they were called the Congregational Bible, because it specifically called out a local assembly of believers,
Right.
not the universal church of England, which is what King James wanted.
That's correct. King James wanted his own church, and he split off from the Catholic Church because the Pope wouldn't let him get a divorce. Well, that started the Church of England. But King James, that was Henry VIII. Henry VIII did that. Yeah. King James.
A Bible for the people.
That's right.
But also wanted it in the common language of the common man. So there were things in there that cities, countries, that we don't know them by that now, but at that time, those locations were known by those names that
Yes.
the common man would understand.
Correct.
Just like love, four different Greek words using one word so that the common man could understand, the uneducated quote unquote man could understand the scripture.
Yes.
That was the reason. There's a lot of those things that went into that.
Yes.
Reason it's on a 4th grade reading level. Well, now that's an 8th grade reading
8th grade,
level.
yeah, right.
That's not saying anything about our reading levels anymore. It's now an 8th grade reading level. 50 years ago it was a 4th grade reading level.
We haven't improved very much.
No, we haven't. We've gone backwards, not forward.
Okay, as we noted that this word simply means assembly. This was a civil assembly. No spirituality to it.
Right.
Any gathering together of people could be called assembly. And it could be for any reason, or any function, or any event.
But it had to be visible.
But it was visible.
And it had to be local.
And it had to be local. Now, that is why Jesus defined the church as his assembly, his ecclesia. He made it specific.
And it wasn't mystical.
And there was no mystical thing about it. He did that to define the difference between his and any other assembly. The town clerk continued to say that the city officials were in danger of being called in question for the day's events. If Rome got word of it, they would have no explanation for the mob violence.
And that would in turn bring about Roman officials coming in with soldiers to quell the violence or...
That is correct. Rome would not be pleased and would take probably violent measures because the local authorities weren't doing their jobs. There was no legal reason for the day's happenings that could be given to the officials in Rome if they were to question the city officials. So they were afraid for their jobs and lives, for that matter.
And you notice it didn't take long, everything kind of just went away.
Yes.
And the reason is that it wouldn't just be the city officials that would pay.
Everybody would pay. Yes.
They would send in those Roman troops to take care of it.
And their freedoms that they had, their livelihoods that they had,
Would be gone.
would be gone.
That's correct.
And he put it in a manner that got their attention, and they dispersed.
So when he had finished speaking, he dismissed the assembly, and probably in no certain terms, and that put an end to that.
That's right.
Any questions or comments before we consider the conclusion? All right, when the uproar was over, Paul again stated that he desired to go into Macedonia and then to Jerusalem. we'll take a look at that endeavor in the next part. We have reached the point now where Paul is coming to a close. There are still a few years left of his life, but he literally is on his final journey. We'll begin that in our next session.
You've been listening to the live broadcast of the Wednesday evening Bible study of the Mayfield Drive Baptist Church in Smyrna, Tennessee. We invite you to tune in at the same time next Wednesday evening for another live broadcast of the Wednesday evening Bible study. We would love to see your comments regarding this broadcast. You may email us at imbr@imbmpodcast.com. That's imbr@imbmpodcasts.com. Or you may write to us at International Missionary Baptist Radio, P.O. Box 1676, Smyrna, Tennessee 37167. That's International Missionary Baptist Radio, P.O. Box 1676, Smyrna, Tennessee 37167. Thank you for listening, and may you have a blessed day.